Very good. Let's begin our session this afternoon by asking the Lord to be with us. Let's pray together. Lord, we come to you again this afternoon, continuing our study of Ellen White's writings and some of the issues. Lord, we want to understand these writings to the best of our ability so that our faith may be strengthened and also our confidence and trust in you. As we look at rules of hermeneutics this afternoon, as we continue in this study, guide us and open up our minds, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Last week together we saw two of the first three rules of hermeneutics. There are many rules that we can use to help us understand the writings of Ellen White. Some books like George Knight's book on reading Ellen White, or the Blue Index books at the very end of the third volume. You know, there are lists there of some rules of hermeneutics. In your textbook, Messenger of the Lord, there's a few chapters on rules of hermeneutics also. Last week we saw two first rules. When we want to study a subject, I think it is normal and it is common sense to study everything we can find on that subject before we get to a conclusion. I think that's wise, that's a good thing. If we were to do a Bible study on the topic of the resurrection, we would take a concordance, look at all the Bible verses on the resurrection, and then we would come to a conclusion as to what the resurrection is about. Let's do the same thing with the writings of Ellen White. Since the CD-ROM has appeared, since it's been published, all the published writings of Ellen White on CD-ROM makes it a whole lot easier to do this kind of study. Years ago, before the CD-ROM, we had to take these blue index books and we had to flip through the pages, hopefully find the right headings, find the right pages in the books of Ellen White. It was a tedious work. Now with the CD-ROM or with the online database at the Ellen White Estate website, it is so easy to do that kind of work. So it's good, common sense. We start by study everything there is. A second major rule to understand the writings of Ellen White, it is to look at the context. The time, the place, the circumstances should be closely examined to see if what applied then should apply to us today. We saw some example of that last week, that depending on the context, Ellen White would probably say things differently today, and even in her own days, she said things differently depending on who she wrote to and what the contexts were. Today we look at a third rule. And the third rule is when we look at some of the writings of Ellen White, particularly on lifestyle issues, that's usually where that one applies very closely. We should try to understand the principle that she's talking about in this counsel in regard and in contrast with the specific rule that she is mentioning in the counsel. So let's try to understand the principle behind the rule. And we'll look at some of these examples. I remember years ago when I did my MDiv. And for the very first time, this class was taught. And I was in the very first classroom that this class was taught, the writings of Ellen White. Dr. Roger Kuhn taught this class, 1983, the spring of 1983. And I took that class, sat in there, and listened and listened and listened. Of all the lectures that Dr. Kuhn presented that spring, this one I'm going to present this afternoon is the one that I remember the most and the one that has been the most helpful in my pastoral ministry. Now, a lot of other things were talked about in that class that day, 20-some years ago. But this lecture is the one that changed my approach to the writings of Ellen White. It had a very great impact upon me personally. And I hope that what we discuss here today will be very helpful to you too for your pastoral ministry. So what do we mean by this rule, this approach to hermeneutics, to try to understand the principles behind the specific rules of to do this or to not do something? So let's look at that here together this afternoon. One should try to discover the principle involved in any specific counsels and its applications. That's the rule we want to work with. Well, first of all, what's a principle? Let's define our terms so that we will speak the same language. What is a principle? I call a principle an unerring, unchanging rule of human conduct or behavior. It's unerring and it's unchanging. In other words, it applies anywhere, anytime. Universal in the fact that a principle will apply to all men and women in all places. That's the horizontal aspect here of this principle. Regardless of the culture we're from, regardless of where we may be born, or the city we may live in, that principle will apply. It is a universal principle. A second part of understanding a principle is what I call the eternal aspect of the principle. And that principle applies regardless of the time in which we live. So it's a good principle in the time of Moses. It's a good principle in the time of Jesus. It should be a good principle today. So universal and eternal. An unchanging, unerring rule of idea, concept regarding human conduct or behavior. That's what I mean by a principle. And that is different from a specific rule in particular. All right, so universal and eternal. We want to look at that when we talk about some of the issues there regarding the writings of Ellen White. Let me give you a couple of examples. I find that love your neighbor as yourself is an eternal, universal principle that Jesus gave us. It's eternal because it applies just as much in His time as it does for us today. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's an eternal principle. It's a universal principle also because it applies to anybody, anywhere, wherever we live. Now, we may do it differently. In our culture, we may love our neighbors perhaps a little differently than somebody who lives in a very close-knit family village, and so on. So it will be applied perhaps a little differently depending on where we are and so on. But the idea is an eternal and a universal idea. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's as good for anybody, anytime. Another one that goes along with this is do good unto others. That also is a universal, eternal principle. God invites us to do good to anybody, anytime, and it's good. It applies as much to me as it applies to anybody else on this planet. So that's what I mean here by eternal, universal principles. They're broad. They're broad concepts that will apply to anyone. Eternal and universal principles are applied to specific contextual situations through specific counsels. For example, love your neighbor as yourself in our culture here may mean that when there's a snowstorm, we're going to go help our elderly neighbor who's not able to shovel her driveway or her sidewalk. So because we're in good health and we've got some time and we're out there doing our own sidewalk, so why not go help the elderly neighbor? So we'll take our shovel, we'll walk over her walkway, and we'll shovel her walkway. So that's an application of a very broad principle. The idea is to love our neighbor. How do I do that? I'll go shovel the driveway. I'll go shovel the sidewalk. Or I know my neighbor has had surgery and he's got a little thing that needs to be done around the house. I hear about it. I'll go help. That's how I manifest my love for my neighbor. Now, for those of us who live in a dorm, well, we'll do this or that to help somebody in the dorm to love our neighbor as ourselves. We'll turn down the music and not have it too loud at night. And we won't stomp on the floor because, that may bother somebody who's below us, and, and on and on. Or we live in an apartment building, and so we behave in a particular way. That's the way we show our love for our neighbor. The application of the principle will be a little different depending where we live and what we do and who we are. But the idea, the big idea, the broad concept, that one is good forever. So our circumstances will change things. Well, let's start with a first example. All right, here's this one, 1903, and I'm talking to ladies. All right, ladies, this one is for you. Ellen White wrote in the book Education in 1903. She gave this counsel to young women. Girls who could learn to harness and drive a horse would be better fitted to meet the emergencies of life. All right, ladies, No, all right, gentlemen. How many of you know how to harness and drive a horse? Gentlemen. All right, not many. Not many. Okay, I want to ask, well, how about the ladies? Any of you know how to do that? Yes, all right, there are a couple that need. How come 3/4 of you don't know how to do that? You don't have a horse. All right, stay with me here. I think something is happening. What have you done in your mind automatically when I put the slide and you read this sentence? What did you do in your mind? What did you talk? What did you think about instead of thinking about a horse? You thought about a car. You thought about a car. All right, so subconsciously, you didn't know that was happening, but you did exactly what I'm trying to talk about this afternoon. Is that here is Ellen White giving a very practical counsel to girls going to Adventist schools in 1903. And she says to the administrators, or to the people in her book Education, you know, young ladies, they should know how to harness and drive a horse. Because, you know, if there are some life emergencies, they live on a farm somewhere and they're stranded, it would be a good thing for them to know how to do that. Sure enough, that's a good idea. But subconsciously in our minds, we made a switch. And we thought of a car instead. That today, I think young ladies should know how to do minor tune-ups, change a tire, and if something doesn't quite work, but it's not major, would at least know how to do it. Would not be stranded, and would know how to change some things. All right, I know that cars have become a whole lot more complicated now. Most of us guys don't know how to do most of the things on these cars. But it's so true. But still, the point is here. Didn't you do that immediately in your minds? You did. You did. So what should we do with this counsel? How should we understand it in our modern society? Is it imperative that Seventh-day Adventist schools teach a girl how to harness and drive a horse? That's what it says in the book. That's right, in the book Education, that's what it says. Okay. Let's look at the internal context. Stay with me here. Stay with me. Let's look at the internal context. Right there in that chapter of the book Education. Ellen White is urging girls, as well as boys, by the way, to obtain a practical education. That's the principle. Practical education. She's talking about high school level here also. In order to be better fitted to meet life's emergency situations and so on. That's the internal context of that chapter. What's the external context, the circumstances in which people live in 1903? Well, cars are not quite yet. They're just about beginning, 1900, 1890, late 90s. I think the first cars begin to appear. But it's not mass-produced yet, so we're not talking about cars yet. We're talking about living in a rural area for most of North America. There's no electricity. There's no phone. The roads are terrible. And in the winter, people are stranded for real. If you've got a snowstorm of a couple feet, there's no plows to remove it. You've got to live with it. So, and so on. So people live in rural America, and she's thinking that young people should receive a very practical education so that if there are any kinds of life emergencies, they'll be able to cope with them. So that's the idea. So the internal context, that's rule number 2, and the external context help us to understand a little bit more what she's trying to say here. So to understand principle and rules and so on, it's good to use the context also, to look at that. You need to keep all these rules together. They all feed into each other. So that's a good idea. So the application today, yeah, we've agreed to that. It's simply to do some basic auto care and maintenance, some little tune-ups to be able to do some of those little things. If you turn the ignition key, the key in the ignition, and no noise happens, you know that's an electrical problem. There's no current. If you turn the key and the motor cranks, and it cranks and cranks and cranks and cranks, but there is no firing, well, then you've got some other kind of problem. It's a line problem. The gas is not getting there, or the spark plugs are not quite getting there. So, all right? Good for girls to know that too, and guys to know that too. Okay? That's what Ellen White, I think, is trying to tell us. So should we, let's bring it home. Should we tell our Adventist academies today that girls should learn and boys should learn how to drive and harness a horse? We would say, come on now. Of course not. That's not part of life anymore. But basic auto care, though, is okay. Hey, why don't we look at the whole quote altogether? You know, the whole thing. Here's the whole quote. Page 216 to 17 in the book Education. Since both men and women have a part in homemaking, point number 1, only the women? No, the men too. Boys, oh yeah, watch out here. Boys as well as girls should gain a knowledge of household duties. To make a bed and put a room in order. To wash dishes. To prepare a meal. To wash and repair his own clothing. All of this, stay with me here. All of this is training that need not make any boy less manly. It will make him happier and more useful. Here's a mother talking. It's a mother talking here. And if girls, in turn, could learn to harness and drive a horse, and to use the saw and the hammer, as well as to rake and the hoe, they would be better fitted to meet the emergencies of life. All right, the beauty of this passage is that it's so practical. It is so practical that in our teenagers' education, we should learn practical things so that everybody is useful around the house, and that, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It will not make a boy less manly to know how to cook and to iron clothes and to cook good too, yes. And it will not make a girl less womanly if she learns how to dirty her hands working under the hood of the car. All right, so, Andrew.
I have a quick question.
All right, quick question here.
I was wondering if Ellen White would have been a male prophet, would have she given the same advice?
I don't know. I guess you know the answer to that.
I don't know that.
Well, I don't know.
What was the question?
The question is, if Ellen White had been a man, would she have given the same counsel? Hey, that's not the point. I think the point is that it is a practical counsel. And that's the idea here. All right, so we get the idea. This is a very easy illustration of trying to get the principle out of down-to-earth counsels. Okay, that one made us laugh. Let's look at some of the other ones. Okay? How shall we pray? I have received letters, Ellen White says, questioning me in regard to the proper attitude to be taken by a person offering prayer to the sovereign of the universe. Where have our brethren obtained the idea that they should stand upon their feet when praying to God? All right, hang on. One who has been educated for about 5 years in Battle Creek was asked to lead out in prayer before Sister White should speak to the people. She's speaking in the third person here. She's the one writing this. But as I beheld him standing upon his feet, upright upon his feet, while his lips were about to open in prayer to God, my soul was stirred within me, she said, to give him an open rebuke. Now, can you imagine? She's on the platform behind him. Calling him by name, I said, get down upon your knees. This is the proper position always. All right? Okay? You understand the situation? Ellen White is going to preach in Battle Creek that day. This is the worship hour, Sabbath morning, very likely. And there's this young man. He's a student at Battle Creek College to study for ministry. he has been invited to offer prayer that day. Likely we're talking about the pastoral prayer here, not the invocation, not the invocation at the very beginning of worship, more the pastoral prayer. And so she sees him going to the pulpit and inviting the congregation to either stand up or to remain seated. And she's distracted by that. I know. And she's distracted by that. She's offended by that. And so she's behind him, and I can imagine leaning toward him, calls him by name, and she says, so and so, get down on your knees. That's the proper position always. Period. All right? Well, that's quite a strong word here. The last word. Always. When we're talking to the sovereign of the universe, that's the proper position always. That raises some questions, doesn't it? The questions are, okay, so whenever we pray, we must kneel down. And if we don't, what's happening here? And so on. So this raises some questions in our minds. What does she mean by this? Remember, one of the reasons why we're using rules of hermeneutics is to help us understand what the prophet mean by what the prophet says. Rule number 1, study everything she has to say on this subject before we get to a conclusion. Let's do that. Let's do that. Study all available information. And so here she says, Gospel Workers, page 178. Both in public and private worship, it is our privilege to bow down on our knees before the Lord when we offer our petitions to Him. Now she uses the word, it is our privilege. Seems to be a little softer in saying it here. It is our privilege. But let's continue. So here's one. All right, it's our privilege to kneel. Steps to Christ. There is no time or place in which it is inappropriate to offer up a petition of God. In the crowds of the street, in the midst of a business engagement, we may send up a petition to God. We should have the door of the heart open continually and our invitation going up that Jesus may come and abide as a heavenly guest in the soul. Well, I don't think she's talking about kneeling here, because she's talking about the fact that when we are walking on the crowds of the street, when we're having a business engagement, business lunch or business meeting, and we're transacting some business there with some other people, she says, send up a prayer to God. As you walk, as you talk, send a prayer to God so that God may be your guest and walk along with you and help you in what you're doing there. There's no idea of kneeling here in this case. It would be quite dangerous, in fact, to do that in the streets of New York City. And it would be quite foolish that when you're doing part of your work with some banker or some other person, you kneel down to offer a prayer to God. There's common sense to be used here. And it implies that no, she's not talking about kneeling here. She's talking about just the heart breathing a prayer to God. Another gospel worker quotes, we may commune with God in our hearts. When engaged in our daily labor, we may breathe out our heart's desire, inaudible to any human ear. So whatever we do, whenever we do it, we can talk to God. There's another beauty of prayer, that you can walk to school and pray to God. You can go somewhere, you got something heavy on your heart, you're driving, and you pray to God as you do it. That's the beauty here. And she's inviting us. Yeah, please continue, do that. That's a good idea. Selected Messages, Volume 3. We must pray constantly with a humble mind and a meek and lowly spirit. We need not wait for an opportunity to kneel before God. We can pray and talk with the Lord wherever we may be. Whoa. We need not wait for an opportunity to kneel before the Lord. Well, to this young man in Battle Creek, she says it's the proper position always. And here she says, well, you don't need to have an opportunity to kneel to talk to God. You can talk to God anytime. Well, all right, there are two little bit of things happening here. But let's continue in everything that we say or that we want to read in her writings. Couple more. Counsels on health. You cannot always be on your knees in prayer, but your silent petitions may constantly ascend to God for strength and guidance. Well, she uses the word always here, but she's got a negative with it. You cannot always be on your knees. And then ministry of healing. It is not always necessary to bow down on your knees in order to pray. Well, that becomes a little contradictory here. To the young men, she says proper position always. And here a couple of times she uses the word, no, it's not always necessary to do that. Well, let's turn to Scripture. We've looked at many passages of Ellen White. Let's turn to Scripture. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about praying. And he talks about the unconverted Pharisees, who apparently were not the only ones who upon occasions were praying standing. When people went to the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, the trend was that people did not kneel. People walked into the precincts of the sanctuary and they stood up to pray to God. And so here's a story of the Pharisee and the Publican, and they both are standing when they pray to God. One, his prayer is not accepted by God. The other one, it is. But they're both standing. They're not kneeling. Solomon, at the dedication of his temple, he knelt for prayer of confession, and he also stood for certain other prayers and then knelt again, and so on. So there's kneeling and standing when the Solomon's temple is being dedicated. And First Chronicles also has some, or early Second Chronicles also talks about the same prayer here. So there are some examples in Scripture of people who talked to God and they were standing when they did so. Well, let's look at Ellen White's practice. That's good to do. If we can, find how did she practice what she preached. That could give us some information on how to understand what she's trying to say here. In 1887, on one occasion when she was in Europe, she instructed the people to remain seated for the prayer. Okay, we find that in her diary. She just chronicles a little bit what has happened during that meeting. People were seated. 1909, in one prayer, she and the congregation knelt after standing for consecration. She likely made a call, an altar call of some kind. People stood up, and then for the prayer of consecration, she invited people to kneel down. So that's 1909. Some other examples in which that she stood and invited the people to stand with her. And I give you three here. These are meetings in Oakland, California, or in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She's inviting the people to stand with her when she prayed. D.E. Robinson was one of her secretaries until she died in 1915. And here's what he says regarding his experience of Ellen White and prayer. I have been present repeatedly at camp meetings and general conference sessions in which Sister White herself has offered prayer with the congregation standing and she herself standing. Arthur White remembers his grandmother, that Ellen White did not intend to teach, well, regarding this quote here, the very first quote, where she talks to this young man and tells him, kneel down, it's the proper position always. Reflecting on that quote, Arthur White says that Ellen White did not intend to teach that on every prayer occasion we must kneel is made clear both by her words and her example. To her there was no time or place where prayer was not appropriate. Her family testified that in her home those at the dining table for grace bowed their heads and not their knees. She was not known to kneel for the benediction at the close of services she attended. The earnest counsel on kneeling would seem to have its principal application. I like the idea of principle here. In the worship services, in the house of God, and private devotions at home. In public ministry, that is, during evangelistic meetings, there were times when she stood for prayer. You see what Arthur White is saying here, trying to understand the situation? He understands that what Ellen White is trying to say here, it's the proper position always, refers particularly and specifically when we're having prayer in worship services in the house of God or private devotions at home, when it is a moment when we are focusing on that all together. Just that's the time to do that. That's the time to kneel, and that's the proper position. Other times, evangelistic meetings, when we have prayer of consecration, people stand. When we're having invocation, we're having benediction, when we're having other kinds of prayer, like for example here in this class, there are other positions. We're not having, in this class for example, when we begin class, we're not having a huge, long petition to God here. We're wanting to invite God to be present among us. So we have our prayer and we continue. But in a worship service like pastoral prayer, where we are all focusing together on a very particular moment of the worship service, here's Ellen White's counsel, and I think this is where it really applies. Here's an example, Ellen White, 1892. That's an interesting one regarding prayer again. She said, "I was not able to bow my knees in the opening prayer or when I entered the desk, the pulpit, as I usually do. But the form is not the essential part. My heart went up to God in earnest prayer, and He did help me, and I believe gave me a decided message for the people assembled." 1892, Ellen White is in Australia. And with age, Ellen White began to have problems with arthritis and rheumatism. Her knees were causing her a lot of trouble the older she got. And there were some times when the pain was so strong that she could not kneel. Cortisone was not known in those years. Painkillers like Advil and Aleve and whatever it may be. That was not known in those years. People did not use those to help with the pain of arthritis. And so Ellen White still wanted to preach and be of service to God. So she would go to these churches, and that's the custom, When we enter the platform on Sabbath morning, what do pastors and the platform party usually do? We kneel. We get to our chairs, and the first thing we do, we kneel. Silent prayer to God. Please, God, bless us as we conduct this worship service. Guide the words we're going to speak. The preacher particularly says a very ardent prayer of help and guidance here from God, while the rest of the congregation is seated and thinks and reflects on what's happening. Well, she says that's her custom. That's what she says we should do. When we enter the pulpit, we should kneel. But on that occasion, she was not able to do that. Too old. Her knees are not working very well anymore. And so she remained seated, bowed her head, and asked God to bless her for that service. There was a pastoral prayer that came up a little later during the service. She did not kneel. She remained seated during that pastoral prayer. And then she makes that comment, the form is not the essential part, but it's the heart being in tune with God. That's the essential part. All right, well, let's wrap this up here. We've seen all kinds of passages, all kinds of examples from the life of Ellen White and her practice itself. What do we gain from this? Some people could say, well, there's a lot of contradiction here, and things don't seem to add up very well. But I gained some principles from this. I gained some very clear principle when we're talking about prayer. Pastoral prayer in worship Sabbath morning, or at home when we're having family devotion. Principle number 1, we should have reverence for God. And I sense that young man who approached the pulpit in Battle Creek, I sense that she sensed he did not have reverence for God. And it was not showing this reverence by standing up and maybe being aloof a little bit to what was going to happen. And so she calls him by name and tells him, kneel down. Proper position always. Here she says, there should be an intelligent knowledge of how to come to God in reverence and godly fear with devotional love. There is a growing lack of reverence for our Maker, a growing disregard of His greatness and His majesty. Here's the idea of the principle of reverence. When we pray to God, is there reverence? And kneeling shows reverence much more than remaining seated in the pew and half seated and half sleeping at the same time. You know how we do sometimes in pews? We tend to lounge a little bit backward, and we're not very straight seating up anymore. And she's talking about reverence here. And we can show reverence by kneeling. A second principle I gained from that is that of dependence upon God. Kneeling shows dependence on God. both in public and private worship, it is our duty to bow down upon our knees before God when we offer our petitions to Him. This act shows our dependence upon God. So I gained two principles out of all these counsels of Ellen White regarding the proper attitude in prayer: respect, reverence, and dependence. And I think we should show that the best we can. Yes, she does say the form is not really what matters most, but that attitude of the heart is what matters most. And so when we're having worship, when you're leading out in a worship service, when I am, and you look over the congregation, and the floor is in ceramics, and so to kneel on that floor is going to be an awful painful experience if the prayer lasts more than a couple minutes. So what do? But you look over the congregation and you see that half the people, they are lounging in their seats. They're not really paying attention, or they're not in an attitude of reverence and prayer and dependence upon God. So what do? Just offer the prayer and leave everybody seated? Why not inviting people to stand up so that there is a shake-up here a little bit? And let's reflect that we are addressing the Father in heaven. Kneeling is okay too. It's going to be a little more painful if the prayer is too long. And that distracts. People don't like that. And we lose the sense of the prayer. But if the floor is carpet, it's not a big deal to kneel for 2 or 3 minutes in a prayer. Older folks cannot do it. Older folks can't. I mean, their knees are bothering them, and you'll see them. They'll just bow their heads and they'll remain there. So let's be mindful. I think this is what Ellen White is saying here. Let's be mindful of reverence and attitude toward God. These are the principles I get from all of that. Well, let me pause. A few questions. Always it's very clear. Okay? Yes, Greg. The form.
Yeah, the form is not the essential part.
Yes.
That seems to be the theme that she's saying, but yet she chastised the brother
For not kneeling.
for not needing
She chastised him for not kneeling. That's right.
and if the form is not that important, and the heart is, how can we determine the person's heart?
That's a very good question. If the form is not that important, but the heart is important, how can we know the difference? You know, we can't. Maybe she could at that particular moment. Maybe we know there are a lot of things we don't see here in this quote. When the young man stood up and went to the pulpit to offer this prayer, what was his attitude? Was he a little flippant when he approached the desk to the pulpit to invite the people to pray? Maybe she noticed that, and maybe, on the spur of the moment, she just, it jibed her a little bit, and she said, no, that's not the way we're going to do it here today. And, when the prophet speaks, people better listen. So, yeah, perhaps there are some things, the context that we quite don't have. We don't quite have everything, but the thought is there. Let's be mindful of who we're talking to when we're having prayer. Yes?
The letter where she stated to pray always, was that a much earlier letter than
The dates, I don't have the dates. I'm sorry, I don't have that. It would be a good thing to add.
It could be an issue of her growth.
It could be an issue of her growth. It could be an issue of her health also. It's very likely that when this young man stood up in Battle Creek, she may not have had knee problems as much that day. But when we get to Australia in the 1890s, she has a lot of problems with her knees. You know that Ellen White fell off a horse in the 1870s. They were in Colorado on their way to a little cottage to spend some vacation time. The horse she was on got spooked, and she fell off the horse and broke both ankles. We're in the 1870s here. And so you know what medicine is like? And so her ankles were never really set back properly. And so she's always having leg, knee, ankle problems from that time on. And the older she gets, Michigan is very humid, arthritis is awful, and so she's having more and more problems as the older she gets. She gains more weight also, by the way, because of that. She can't do exercise very much anymore. So yeah, issue of growth, issue of context, which we don't really know in that quote there with that young man. Sven.
It suggests to me that it has something to do with its education too, because it makes a point of saying this is a guy who's been educated for 5 years. And when he stands up to pray, you don't have enough education to know that when you pray before God, you should kneel.
Yes.
You should be reverent.
That's right.
So this might be maybe a little critique to the education that he's gotten, that he's a little bit too cocky with God.
Okay.
Thinking that he's got,
Well, thank you. That's a very good point. She does say that at the beginning of her paragraph there, that this young man had been educated at Battle Creek for 5 years. That's a ministerial student. So a little cockiness there. Okay, I think that's good context there. Yes? Is kneeling an indicative sign of reverence? In some of her quotes we read, yes, it is. Is that cultural? We would say yes. To some extent it is. In Scripture we find both. Standing up in the temple and kneeling also at the dedication of the temple. We see both in Scripture. In some cultures, let's take the Muslim culture, kneeling is very important. They pray standing and kneeling, and not only kneeling, but bowing, prostrating before God. Yes, it is cultural. How do we show reverence? In our Western culture, we show reverence by taking our hats off and kneeling. In an Asian culture, when we go to church, we take our shoes off. When you enter a mosque, you take your shoes off, and so on. So that's all important. Yes, Gio.
It's interesting that at the end of time, I think this kneeling is a universal aspect because every knee will bow. And he makes it a point that every knee will bow. So it seems to
Philippians chapter 2.
it
Every
seems
knee
to
shall
be a
bow.
universal acknowledgement of a deity or of someone in a higher authority.
Very good. That's a good thought too. At the end of time, Paul says in that beautiful poem about Jesus that every knee shall bow. Yes, okay. So it's a sign of reverence. It's a sign of accepting the majesty of God. Troy.
I was wondering, I thought you were going to put this quote in. I've read it in the compilation they put together about prayer. Ellen White's compilation of prayer says she quotes, she says the only symbol of somebody standing in prayer is the hypocrite's prayer in the Bible. I don't know if you ever saw that quote.
I've never seen that quote. Oh, yeah, okay. Let me take it for granted. She says in that compilation, as far as you say, I have not seen that quote, that the sign of a hypocrite is standing in prayer.
The only time of anybody standing in prayer is the time when the hypocrite is praying in the temple. That's
All right. Well, if we look carefully at Matthew and Luke, where you've got the Pharisee and the Publican, they are both standing. They're both standing. One is accepted, the other one is rejected. So,
somebody will find it for you.
okay, all right. Well, let me take one more and then we'll take our break. Yes.
I'm just, along with Gio, it seems like to say that kneeling is a cultural item, I'm not sure that I can understand that, because for me to understand something cultural would be to look at a time or place where it isn't or is accepted, but we, similar to the Sabbath, how do we prove the Sabbath is eternal? We look before the Jews, during the Jews, and after the Jews.
Yes.
And the same thing for kneeling.
It's all over the place.
Is something I find
It's all over.
mentioned throughout Scripture.
That's right.
Of course,
But when I answered the idea of cultural and saying, yes, there's some cultural aspect to prayer, I had in the back of my mind something that maybe I need to share with you. Most of your Baptist friends do not kneel in church. Baptists, as far as I know, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, do not kneel in church. They will never kneel in a church. They will stand up to pray, they will sit to pray, but they will not kneel to pray in a church. They'll do it at home, when they're having worship at home, but not in the church. I wonder if there's a cultural education there, as far as Baptists are concerned, for not kneeling in church. They have their reasons, but that's what I had in my mind here, that there are even some Christians that look at prayer from different angles. But I agree with all that you've said. You find prayer all over in Scripture. Kneeling, all over in Scripture. Okay. Let's take our break.